Okay, let me welcome everyone here. This is a very impressive turnout, and it's hard to determine in whose zechut, because there are so many people involved whose zechut it could be. The speaker, the speaker's father, the speaker's grandfather, each of whom is worthy of such a turnout in his own right. I think that virtually everyone who came knows who Professor Mirsky is. I can tell you that his grandfather was the rabbi of the shul that I went to during my college years, and he was a scholar of the first rank, an exceedingly important figure in American Orthodoxy, as well as in Yeshiva. I knew his father. I didn't know him very well, but he was also a very impressive person, and you'll hear something about this. Our speaker has wrote a prize-winning book about Rav Kook, and in addition to his very impressive academic credentials, is also what is sometimes called a public intellectual. Public intellectuals, even good ones, are often somewhat deficient in their academic backgrounds and their real knowledge, deep knowledge of the material on which they opine, a word that I never use. In this case, we have that unusually impressive public intellectual who is a genuine scholar with profound knowledge of the subjects that he addresses, and in this case, not only profound knowledge, but personal knowledge. Professor Mirsky.
Thank you. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, and Professor Berger, and to everyone who's here. You know, I mean, believe me when I say it's genuinely an honor to be in touch with Professor Berger about anything. Just last, I think it was a year ago this semester, in one of my courses, I devoted an entire lecture just to working carefully through one of Professor Berger's articles with all the students, because I thought his work, even more than deserves and repays that kind of close reading. So I'm deeply honored that you invited me here and suggested this, and I believe it was also Dr. Elazar Horvitz who first proposed this suggestion as well. Thank you for that, and it's so wonderful to see friends and family and who in various incarnations in Gilgulim, et cetera, and antecedents there too will be appearing this evening, and also I'm trusting that members of my family and will correct me where appropriate and necessary. So the occasion here is that again, Professor Berger contacted me last summer, pointing out that we were coming up indeed on the 50th yahrzeit of my grandfather, Shmuel Kalman Mirsky, and wouldn't it be nice to do something here at YU to mark that? And of course, I agreed, and at the same time couldn't help but observing that this past year was also the 35th yahrzeit of my sister Tzipora is here, our father. And it's, as we went back and forth on it, it seemed that, rather than sort of a straightforward yahrzeit, the looking at the life and life work of these two figures is something that also would repay a little study. And actually, I'm using PowerPoint for one of the first times in my life. Thank you. And sort of the formulation that it's never easy to sort of try and encompass somebody's life, and sort of encompassing the lives of people whom you know up close, and trying to do so with something like, you can't say rigor or dispassion, talking about family members, but at least lucidity, can be challenging. Now, I did want to say that what I the basic idea that I want to work with here, looking at these two figures, our grandfather and father, is that I think looking at the two of them and their respective life stories, which they represent, so to speak, two moments or two vectors in the history of this institution, Yeshiva University, in the history of Judaism in America, religious Zionism, modern Orthodoxy. And their stories are these sort of very Jewish Orthodox Zionist stories, and also very American stories. And I think they represent their life and life's work bespeak two, as I said, to sort of two vectors, 2 points of direction. One, our grandfather, Shmuel Kalman Mirsky, in a sense, going very deep, going very deep in Judaism and in Zionism, and in complementary fashion, our father, David Mirsky, going wide, and representing two different moments in the evolution of Yeshiva University and Judaism and Jewish life in America, with a lot of commonalities and a lot of things that are shared. Both of them, intellectuals and scholars, both of them believing in building institutions. So we'll see in my grandfather's case, very much building institutions bridging Israel and America, and Israeli and American intellectuals and cultural figures. And our father, building Yeshiva University and working with non-Jewish institutions in America. Not only to secure the place of Yeshiva University and all that implied, but also to have Yeshiva University as an institution that is contributing to the larger culture. So these two different and complementary directions, creating a kind of educational landscape and civic culture that I think is worth looking at. Now, what I've said now is about as abstract as I'm going to be in the course of this evening. Clicker in hand, I'll be walking through a lot of pictures and illustrations and talking about them and illustrating them. I actually have written a lengthy, substantial monograph on our grandfather. Anyone who wants to find it, it appeared in the Festschrift that was recently published in honor of Rabbi Professor Daniel Sperber by Bar-Ilan University Press. It's on my page at academia.edu, and I'll be happy to email it to anyone. Write me at mirsky@brandeis.edu. And that's, platoons of footnotes and, Latinate, sentences with lots of dependent clauses and the whole 9 yards. But I hope to do something a little different this evening. So what I want to do is sort of walk through again with pictures, but with a bit of talking from me. First, of the life and trajectory of our grandfather, and then of our father. Of course, they overlap chronologically. How could they not? But I think for the trajectories that I'm trying to trace, that's not unhelpful. So, and as you see from the title, here I'm talking about Sheiltot and Shakespeare. Again, I'm trying not just to be clever and alliterative here, right? But sort of like the text on which our grandfather worked, right? And we'll explain why. Sheiltot and Shakespeare, what that conveys, right? Engagement with classic rabbinic texts. And our father's field was literature, English literature. Bialik and Baldwin, the modern Hebrew revival of a certain kind. And Baldwin, not just James Baldwin, but the minorities in American literature and in post-war America are going to be playing a role here as well. So we start in Jerusalem, shortly after World War I, with the wedding of Shmuel Kalman Mirsky and Shulamit Solomon. So first a word about our grandmother. Shulamit Solomon was a fifth-generation Jerusalemite. She was a granddaughter of Yo Moshe Solomon. Those of you who've like walked along Yo Moshe Solomon Street. So on her father's side, she was a descendant of the Solomon family. Her mother's side, of the Parish family, right? Yeah. Just in terms of the history, right? As our relative Rabbi Horowitz knows well. And it's so interesting, just sort of the little chestnut about that. Of course, when we talk about Aliyat Talmidei Hagra and the legacy of the sort of like Aliyat, the legacy of Aliyat Talmidei Hagra tends to go into two directions, and in a sense represented by these two clans, Solomon and Parish. The elders of Aliyat, the Parish family taking like the Gra's agenda of like a kind of hermetic society of Torah study, and the Solomons representing the sense that Aliyat Talmidei Hagra, and this, again, historians argue about this, but some kind of naturalized messianism and urging the building of institutions, and in particular Ashkenazi institutions in Palestine. At any rate, that was our grandmother, who was orphaned at a young age.
What year was this?
They got married, I think, in 1920. And as far as Shmuel Kalman over here. So he was born in Moldova in 1899. His father, Moshe Tzvi, about whom more in a little bit, and his mother, Esther Sprinza, migrated to Palestine in about 1905 in response to the Kishinev pogroms. One of the reasons they chose, it's a long story, but a reason they chose Palestine over America at the time was that their son was considered an Eloi, and they wanted him to grow in Jerusalem. He grew up in Mea Shearim. He started studying at Yeshiva, then it was called Torah Chaim, then became, it's in the building that today is Ateret Kohanim in the Old City. And he studied Yeshiva Eitz Chaim. As an adolescent, he actually, in a touch of adolescent rebellion, he went to study with Rav Uziel. Right. Which will sort of come to play a small role later in our story as well. So which, as adolescent rebellions go, it's kind of interesting. At any rate, in the course, like so many of the Olim, the period in which our great-grandfather came and his family went on Aliyah is the period of the second Aliyah, and mostly we talk about the second Aliyah for the people that I teach about in my courses, right? Aaron David Gordon and Yosef Chaim Brenner and Avram Yitzchak Cook and all of that. But the vast majority of people who came in the second Aliyah were like our great-grandfather. They were like pious Jews who needed to leave Russia because they were poor, and because Russia was becoming violent. And a lot of them chose Eretz Yisrael, and they were trying to earn a living there, which was tricky. Especially his profession was safrut. He was a sofer. And so he was traveling back and forth to America, which meant that when America declared war on Turkey, his son Shmuel Kalman was a foreign national, and he was interned in Syria, in Damascus. And interestingly, when he was released from Damascus, on the way back, his companion, an older companion of his on the way back, was David Yellin. David Yellin, the great scholar, Orientalist, right? Traditional maskil, who was very intrigued by having this like young man with an encyclopedic memory who he could talk to about a lot of things, and Yellin made a huge impression on him. I mean, I've suspected at times that he was just generally sort of being shaken up by World War I, a bit, and the whole experience of World War I, and he was becoming exposed to the writings of Abraham Isaac Cook. So after World War I, he leaves the world of the more what today we would call the Haredi ambiance, in which he was raised. He obtained smicha at age 15. He didn't go looking for smicha. There was an elderly Rav, the Butena Rav, who could no longer read. His eyesight failed him, and so he asked one of the local rabbanim to send him a young man to learn with him. So they sent my grandfather, and at some point he wrote out a smicha for it, which my grandfather took home and was too embarrassed to show his family. So he hid it in a safe until eventually it was found. At any rate, so he went out in different directions. And he became active in Zionism. Here we see Chaim Weizmann, on a visit to Jerusalem. I suspect this was a visit in 1921. So here's Chaim Weitzman, and here is Najib Nashashibi, who at the time was the mayor of Jerusalem, and there is Shmuel Kalman Mirsky, right there. So, it's also amazing. Back then in Jerusalem, people would actually wear these stiff collars and jackets and so on. At any rate, he also got a law degree. He went and got the British, wherever they went, opened law schools, right? So this is his law diploma, which hangs in the office of my brother Moshe Tzvi, who was unable to be here tonight through a scheduling error that is entirely my responsibility. It's being recorded. It's being recorded. At any rate, and so the Brits opened law schools wherever they went, right? Like Gandhi went to a British law school in South Africa, right? That's also how British jurisprudence had a large influence on eventually the jurisprudence of the Jewish state. And so he went to law school. He was arguing a few cases, and he was a participant in the earliest conversations of a Chevra L'Mishpat HaIvri. And if you take a look in HaMishpat HaIvri, Volume 1 in 1926, he has an article there on the Takanot of Rabbeinu Gershom. And so in those years, he was teaching in the Tachkemoni school, which was sort of religious Zionism's answer to the gymnasia in Herzliya, and getting involved in Mishpat Ivri. Interesting to note, there really was no university there. Hebrew U was getting founded just in 1925. And then in 1926, they moved to America for family. My great-grandmother, Esther Sprinza, had made my grandfather promise that he would follow the family to America. And so he did. They'd hoped, they knew they would be for a while, they didn't hope it would be forever, but the great crash of 1929 put paid to a lot of people's plans, including those. My great-grandmother, Esther Sprinza, right? Our very beloved and revered cousin, Aaron Beryl, is here, right? And that's his mother, my Aunt Sonia. And our grandmother, my father, later on, our father's younger sister, my Aunt Sarah, Chavatzelet, and Aaron Beryl. I was hoping you could clear up for me who this was. Eva, any thoughts? Do we know who that is?
Next to Shalamis.
Next to Shalamis, right? That's our grandmother, that's Shalamis. We can think about it. At any rate, that's... Maybe Schiffer, yeah, because I don't know. So we can puzzle this out later. So Aunt Sonia was married to my grandfather's brother, David. You may not be familiar with him, but you're familiar with his work every time you use the David font on your computer. Right. And Esther Sprince's father, Yehuda Aryeh Kulik, was a serious Talmud Chacham who had a large role in Shmuel Kalman's education. He has a wonderful reminiscence, by the way, of his walking to Yeshiva in the Old City, right? Those of you, like I said, Torah Chaim is now a Teret Kohanim, it's in the Muslim quarter, and his grandfather would say hello to everybody, including the Arabs. And he would ask them once, why? And he said, well, first off, it's just, he was a Kluger Yid, right? It's be nice to them, maybe they'll be nice to you. Second, Chazal said, Hevi Makdim B'Shalom Shel Kol Adam. He said, Kol Adam. Didn't say Kol Yehudi, didn't say Kol Beit Yisrael, he said Kol Adam. So they came to America. And not long after coming to America, and you saw my great-grandmother, the family business was a Sfarim store on the Lower East Side. And this is a photo of the Sfarim store that appeared in Time magazine in 1942, when they had some feature about the Jews of America. Sort of you see some, nice, girl with a bonnet, etc., standing looking. And down here at the bottom, you can see it says Mirskys. Right? and of course, God bless America, good patriots, on 58 Norfolk Street on the Lower East Side. Okay. Which also was part of my grandfather Shmuel Kalman's lifelong passion for books, and for book collecting, and we'll be hearing more about that later on. Shortly after coming to America, he was contacted by Bernard Revel. Okay, Bernard Revel had read his article in Mishpat Ivri in 1926 on Takanot Rabbeinu Gershom, and Dr. Revel was very current about things that were going on in Jerusalem. Indeed, those of you who don't know, Natan Ophir published a great article a few years ago about contacts between, he found all kinds of correspondence between Dr. Revel and Rav Kook. And Rav Kook had an extended visit to America in 1924. America moved him not at all, as far as I could tell. The only people, again, that's subject to revision if, his letters, etc., from the time are ever published. But the people who we know left an impression on Rav Kook during his visit to America, and even he even met Calvin Coolidge, and Calvin Coolidge left no impression on him, but that's not saying much. He got to know Harry Fischel, whose name is right, who was also a mutual acquaintance of Dr. Revel, as we know. And he met and was very taken with Louis Brandeis. So he said about Louis Brandeis, Brent Mitzedek, he's burning up with justice. And he was very taken with Dr. Revel. And Rav Kook and Dr. Revel corresponded a lot on the possibilities of doing something together. And that too, the Depression of 1929 just wiped that out. Nobody had money to do anything terribly expansive. One comment about Dr. Revel, a little while ago I was reading Rabbi Emanuel Rackman's father, David Rackman, was a Rosh Yeshiva here at YU, and there's a book of his Torah writings called Sefer Chana David, I think? Kiryat Chana David, that's it. And I was looking at it, and there's correspondence between all kinds of people. And what was amazing is there's correspondence with him, young Dov Revel at age 25 is writing him with these ideas about things they have to do for Jewish education in America. And it was just so striking to me, this very young man feeling this profound sense of responsibility. And so he brought Shmuel Kalman to teach at the Teachers Institute, right? And so began long years of teaching and association here. So taught in the Teachers Institute, right? Which eventually, the Mizrahi Teachers Institute, which was merged became the Teachers Institute here, which eventually became Erna Michael College, which today is called Isaac Breuer College, which, thinking about what Isaac Breuer had to think about Zionism is just all kind of interesting. Though at least if you're going to name a one Zionist institution after a critic of Zionism, it's not a bad idea to do it about probably the smartest and deepest religious critic of Zionism. At any rate, and so he taught here, but he also, I remember I had mentioned, eventually moved to Brooklyn, to Borough Park. I had mentioned his having been a disciple of Rav Uziel in 1928. Rav Uziel was visiting America, came and said to him, the Magen David School was without a principal. Okay, you're not exactly one of us, but you studied with me, you know our customs, could you please? So our grandfather actually served as the principal of Magen David for a year or so. Which, and this is a theme that you're going to be hearing more of, the ecumenicism of the man and his son. Now, so he's teaching here, and he starts embarking. He does his academic work at City College and at NYU, and then at Columbia. I think when I was a kid, we still had his dissection kit from the biology course he had to take as an undergrad. We had his Phi Beta Kappa key. And also he becomes very involved in the Hebrew movement in America. Right? As the late lamented Professor Alan Mintz, Alav Shalom, said, right, the Hebrew movement in America is one of the I think he said it's like one of the best kept secrets of American Jewish history, right? That for decades there was a thriving Hebraist movement here in America. And already in the 1920s, it had been around, it got, as we'll see later on, our father wrote an article about Hebrew in the United States before, like in the latter part of the 19th century. It was a pioneering article on excavating that, but the Hebrew movement in America really starts getting going around the time of World War I, and by the 1920s there is this movement, the Histadrut Ivrit, and Shmuel Kalman Mirsky becomes very involved in it, and in a sense becomes the leading religious figure in the Hebraist movement in America. The Hebraist movement in America, which published its weekly newspaper, Hador, for many decades. I think it's a pity nobody's, indexed it. Anybody, especially the students in the room, if you're looking for like primary materials that are really interesting to go through, Hador is a gold mine, because you have generations of Hebrew-speaking, writing intellectuals commenting on everything in America for decades on end. So he wrote something like 150 articles in Hador. I'll get back to this. In Hador over the years. And this one is from the late 1930s, 1939, Chag HaChukah, right? The Constitution was ratified in 1789, 1939. There were these jubilees of the Constitution, and so this is also where America starts coming in, right? Drawing on American ideas of constitution, because he's still writing and thinking and teaching a lot about Mishpat Ivri, and explicitly trying to draw on American ideas of constitutionalism for a putative constitution for a Jewish state. And also he starts getting interested in medieval doctrines of natural law, of the kind that you find in the Rambam and Albo, Yosef Albo, and in Sefer Akedat Yitzchak, as some sort of a basis for a religiously based, ethical, legal system that can speak beyond obviously ethnic divides, and also speak perhaps to Jews who are not religious, as well as speak to non-Jews, etc. He's also writing this under the impress of World War II, when he talks about the Leviathan of nations that threatens to engulf us unless we have the rule of law. He also is very involved in the Mizrahi, and eventually in Hapoel HaMizrahi, becomes sort of, again, a significant figure of Hapoel HaMizrahi here in America, here in one of the Yiddish papers covering the 21st Zionist Congress of 1939, and here he is walking with Rav Moshe Avigdor Amiel, some of you maybe right, the author of Drashot El Ami and so on. And so this is just a lovely picture of him teaching there. And he's starting to also do scholarship. Right? 1944, his journal Talpiot. Right? It starts inaugurating his journals. And Talpiot, this is volume 1, number 1. So Talpiot is a journal, as he says, Riv'on Ninyane Halacha Aguda Umusar Hayadut, right? And of course, you put together, this is the acrostic of Ha'umah. Right? So he's deep, like the other Hebraists in America, he's deeply invested in the cultural revival. In Zionism as a form of cultural revival, right? And in Talpiot is a journal that has sort of classic Torah study, along with academic type scholarship. Again, in this sounding this ecumenical note, it's extraordinary. You fleet in the pages of Talpiot. You will see articles by Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Moshe Feinstein and Rav Uziel and Rav Herzog, and Shaul Lieberman, and Moshe Goshen Gutstein, right? Sort of a kind of diversity that's unimaginable today. I think Yaakov Elman did point out to me once, because also Lieberman and Goldstein were at earlier stages of their careers, perhaps, which made some of that possible. But it's still rather striking and remarkable. And again, we were going to see, he founded a number of journals, because he was always trying to find ways to bring people together, to harness their energies, and to create a new kind of Jewish literature, right? Because it was very important that that the articles here not just be substantive, but also be well edited, right? And because it wasn't a conventional academic journal, right? This was not a peer-reviewed journal. After some early articles in places in Chorev, our grandfather published overwhelmingly in journals that he edited, or volumes that he edited. So occasionally, save for like the occasional festschrift or so on. And sort of these articles being done in an interest in a good Hebrew style was also central to what he was trying to do. And again, just to make the point, if you look at, some of these things, I have some of them at home. Here, in this institution, through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, you had students writing literary essays in Hebrew, right? TI, their yearbook, Hanir, was a full-fledged Hebrew literary periodical, right? The Masmid had Hebrew sections where people were writing literary and cultural essays in like really good Hebrew, often Hebrew that's better than mine today. Here at Yeshiva College, it was just kind of extraordinary. Now, after the war, he started looking for manuscripts in earnest. Right after the war, he began to travel. He got into the got into the Vatican. He was a scholar who got early into the Vatican through connections. It was Cardinal Spellman put him in touch with Cardinal Tisserand, right, who was the librarian of the Vatican. And as he was in addition to his scholarly pursuits, going around looking for manuscripts, there was also a bit of adventure and wanderlust here. And he began to write up his experiences traveling. And so here's this, in addition to, again, the scholarly works you're going to be seeing, this work of Eretz V'Yamim, which is travel literature and travel logs and vignettes and sketches and reminiscences, and essentially belles lettres. He began more and more to travel to back to Eretz Yisrael, and so here he is with Tzvi Yehuda Kook. Right? I haven't been able to identify everyone. This seems to be the late 1940s. This, I think, is Chaim Lifshitz, who's also known as Docent Chaim Lifshitz. I haven't been able to figure out who these other two people are, but any thoughts, I'd be glad to hear. His relationship to Rav Kook is interesting. He was very close with Rav Kook. Rav Kook was the Masadar Kedushin at our grandparents' wedding. Rav Kook was the Kohen at our father's Pidyon Haben. And I've often joked that it seems something didn't work in the ceremony, because here we are, almost a century later, and like the Kohen is still hanging on to, and he records. And he records all kinds of conversations that he had with Rav Kook. What's interesting, actually, was my wife, Tamar Bialik, once pointed out that our grandfather, in some respects, so we'll get back in a second, she put it well once. She said it's like a lot of the Rav Kook vision without the crazy dialectic, without the mystical frenzy, without the jagged edges, without the contradictions, which is not, obviously, there are virtues to Rav Kook's jagged edges and contradictions and mystical explosions, etc. But you see, it's like a fundamentally harmonistic view of things, a harmonistic view of the understanding of humanism and general culture, and Jewish culture and Judaism, a harmonistic understanding of Israel and the diaspora in many ways. Also in his scholarly work, a harmonistic understanding of the relationship of rabbinic sources to one another, which led to some issues in his scholarship proper. We'll get to that. Here he is just in the faculty of TI from the 1950s. And it's him, right? Professor Horgan, right? Eventually founds Bar Ilan University. Again, our father, about whom more in a little bit. Rabbi Galevsky. Hyman Grinstein, right, who's a beloved figure here at YU, author of the first major history of the Jews of New York. Rabbi Melech Schachter. Are there any others? Who am I missing? Anyone? Any thoughts?
There's Agus is there.
Okay, we're
Second next, they're serving Agus.
that's yeah, right.
Either he or the one at the very on the other side.
That's right. And our own Rakefet Rothkopf, right? Okay. So he's also the rabbi of a synagogue. He's the rabbi of the Young Israel of Borough Park. He's right. Is one of his congregants is here. He's the rabbi of the Young Israel of Borough Park. He's at some points head of the Vad Harabanim of Borough Park. He's very active in Beit Sefer Shulamit, which when I was a kid I was chagrined to discover that I'd always thought it was named after our grandmother. Turns out I was wrong about that. And he teach. We long thought that he taught the first Daf Yomi class in America. Turns out that it was the second Daf Yomi class taught in America. Not surprisingly, I learned that from, of course, Menachem Butler, through whom all roads eventually lead. At any rate, he did a number of cycles of Daf Yomi with his shul in the Young Israel of Borough Park, and he published this volume of Hadronim, right, of what you say it's Siyumim. And interestingly, in addition to his various Hadronim, he also has like a study of Hadron literature, this sort of slightly offbeat, somewhat neglected genre of rabbinic literature, and he has this lengthy bibliography of it. And the Daf Yomi Society of the Young Israel of Borough Park published a regular journal called Alei Cheldi, The Pages of Our Lives, which also was a homage to Yitzhak Nissenbaum, the great leader of the Mizrahi, murdered in the Holocaust, because that was the name of Nissenbaum's autobiography. And of course, Alei Cheldi was Alei Chevrat Limud Daf Yomi. Now, also it just bears noting that as you when you go back, as you see like what my grandfather looked like, this was a beardless rabbi. Sort of the great story in the family is that one time he and Louis Finkelstein were vacationing together, and they were learning somewhere, and somebody came, seemed wanted to see, wanted to like ask our grandfather a question, and so he went over to Louis Finkelstein, because Finkelstein is sitting there with the big black yarmulke and the long beard and Tzitzis and Dreisen, next to this other guy with just the mustache and the little kippah. And also, Borough Park back then was a bastion of Hebrew speakers, right? Our father went to Yeshiva Eitz Chaim, and among his classmates there were Gerson Cohen, who eventually becomes the Chancellor of Jewish Theological Seminary, right? Seminary, and others who were there as the children of Hebraists. Right. Now, other scholarly work. So in the 1950s, he puts together this Yizkor book, right? We have the phenomenon of the Yizkor books, the memorial books for destroyed Jewish communities. Again, for the students out there, somebody needs to work on this, the phenomenon of the Yizkor books, which is just kind of extraordinary, that not very long after the war, all these communities managed to find one another, the survivors of these communities. Because you look at the Yizkor books, and so they have the Yotzei Shippishnuk of, there's the group in Buenos Aires, and there's the group in Brussels, and there's the group in Tel Aviv, and there's the group in Texas, and they also managed to come together and gather materials and get it together to do this. If you want to take a look on the website of the New York Public Library, they've digitized a ton of these things. And he does one for the Yeshivot of Europe. Right, so he has survivors, students, write the stories of their yeshivot. And so this book becomes the first draft of the history of Eastern European yeshivot, right? And if you see, say, in the works of Professor Shel Stamfer, right, is now modern classic, on the history of Lithuanian yeshivot, he's very graciously acknowledges his debt to this book as well as to the works of Dov Katz, because what our great, and you notice this is actually, it's published by Ha'istadrut Ha'ivrit America, Hotzaat Ogen of Ha'istadrut Ha'ivrit. The Hebraists are publishing this. And he writes here the essay, not about yeshivas that he studied in, because after all, he left Eastern Europe when he was 6 years old, but Volozhin. And he writes the first historical treatment of Yeshivat Volozhin, first institutional history. He also works on the Meiri, right? He does if you take a look at Jacob Katz's Exclusiveness and Tolerance, which was, which was the book that introduces the Meiri and the Meiri's teachings on, dramatically humanistic teachings on Gentiles to the world. The first footnote goes to Samuel Mirsky's essay, a biographic essay, because it was one of the first biographic studies of the Meiri. He was also working on an edition of Meiri's Chibur HaTshuva itself. Then it turned out that Avraham Sofer had been working on it for a long time, and he chose to defer to Avraham Sofer and let him publish it. After, it was a bit of a story, but that's what happened. Now, he also, another important work of his is Shibbolei Haleket. Shibbolei Haleket, very important medieval work, and medieval halachic work. And in it, he says why he works so extensively on Shibbolei Haleket, and in it, he offers a vision of what he thinks halachic literature should be. He says, I love Shibbolei Haleket, obviously because it's halachically authoritative and, a work of great learning, and because of its crystalline Hebrew. It's written in a very good Hebrew, and because of how nicely it's organized, right? He's of a piece with a whole bunch of things that are happening. This idea of a new Torah literature that's in good Hebrew, that's well organized, right? If you think about the world that produces the Kahati Mishnayot, that produces Encyclopedia Talmudit, right? This cultural milieu of which he's a part. And his collection of essays, articles Ben Shkia Lizricha, which sort of the subtitle says that it's like the tales of like the exit of the Sanhedrin from its historic home till eventually its return to Zion, which is sort of how it works and sort of not, in terms of what the book is, but it's this collection of historical and biographical studies. And what's interesting is that he's very interested in figures who are working the margins of things. So he's very interested, in a sense, in the Meiri of this Provençal culture, which is sort of taking elements of Maimonidean teachings and integrating them into a somewhat more Ashkenazic milieu. He's interested in the Bach. He's interested in the Chida, and again, always trying to write in good Hebrew. He travels a lot to the land of Israel, and I think this is Rav Kapach. I could be wrong. And with him is my uncle Meir Chavatzelet. Mary Zansarin teaches here at YU for many years. I mean, so what this sort of illustrative is that he's like a figure in Israel, and he's a presence in Israel in all sorts of ways, including the World Hebrew Movement. So here, HaKongress HaIvri HaOlami HaShlishi, right? And he's addressing, these old Zionist congresses that were organized like these, Soviet-style party congresses, where they're all talking about the importance of the study of Hebrew, and sitting and listening to him is David Ben-Gurion, who seems remarkably to be enjoying himself. Which, when we think about what Ben-Gurion had to think about, clerics in general, is really quite remarkable. So, but just I love this picture but Ben-Gurion, just like the sheer pleasure on his face.
Could have been wrapping up.
What? He could have been wrapping up. He could have been wrapping up. Now, Surah was another journal he created, and Surah, by the way, something I had neglected to mention about Ish Halacha, about Talpiot, was it's best known as the venue for the first appearance of Rav Soloveitchik's Ish Halacha, which also, again, having seen a little bit of the correspondence between them, there are two, turning it into good Hebrew was a formidable, piece of editorial work. Though that was still probably the most famous article that ever appeared in Talpiot. Now, Surah was another journal, and it was part of a foundation that he created with the explicit idea of bringing together Israeli and American scholars and thinkers on an ongoing basis. And in this way, he was kind of a precursor to a lot of these organizations that arose later, right? Like, even, again, accounting for some very genuine differences, things like the Hartman Institute today, where it sort of would deliberately take Israeli and American, Jewish, scholars, thinkers, rabbis, et cetera, and bring them together. So Sura was doing that as a journal, and Sura was hopefully going to do that as an institution. That's why the present site of, in the Grus in Givat Mordechai was originally it got into the orbit of all this because it was supposed to be the site for Machon Sura. And also officially Yitzchak Ben Tzvi was the official president, like the honorary president of Sura, and also used to write articles for it. And this is another journal that he created called Prakim Bit'on Academia Ivrit America. The idea that there be a scholarly Hebrew journal in America. Something that I don't know is that something that I haven't been able to figure out is that there already was Bitzaron in America. And why he felt the need to have a journal in addition to Bitzaron, I don't really know. So this is just, the bookshelf of books that he wrote, edited, and most importantly, Sheiltot Rav Chaim. Okay. So the idea for working on the Sheiltot actually began at our grandparents' wedding. When he was talking with Rav Kook and talking about, very Cookian theme, Ichud ha'alacha v'ha'agada. How does one bring together the halachic and non-halachic, or the halachic and agadic portions of rabbinic literature? And they were chatting, and her grandfather said something like, well, I sometimes think Sheiltot Rav Chai would be interesting in that regard. And Rav Kook said something like, oh yeah, that would be a good idea. Why don't you go look at that? And sort of there he was, pulling it together, pulling together manuscripts, creating not a critical edition, but a variorum edition. But part of his interest in the Sheiltot was also, what we've seen here in his writings is great sort of like diversity of subject matter with great thematic unity. And that's his concern with public education. Right? So he writes all these articles on what were the public lectures in the Babylonian Academy, what was the Pirka, what was the Shabbat of so-and-so, right? And the idea, and so because so much of what he's trying to do is public education, writing a new kind of Torah literature in good Hebrew that's conversant with a lot of disciplines and a lot of issues and areas. And again, sometimes this leads to sort of harmonizing readings, especially rabbinic literature, for which he comes in for some criticism, and some of it, well-founded on the basis of scholars of Talmud and Gaonica. But I think it's helpful to understand the overall project. And for now, this is the edition of the Sheiltot that we have. He worked on it for decades, and he finished it on his deathbed. And it was Aaron Beryl who took it from him right before he died and brought it. Right, and made sure that it got to print. So it's very, very moving that you're here. So here he is talking at YU in the 1960s, and there's a new generation waiting in the wings, right? There's a young Herschel Schachter listening to him. And our grandmother, who passed away in 1965. And does anyone, who is this? Do you know, Professor Berg? Do you know anyone? I've been wondering who that is. And on his passing, there's, at age 60, there was a volume that had come out in his honor, Sefer Yovel, and then a memorial volume edited by Gershon Appel, about whom more in a moment. And along with his colleagues, right? Chaim Leaf, right, and I'm having trouble. Right. Yes. Right. And then the very last edition of the very last volume of Talpiot was also posthumous. And interestingly, the first article in the first issue of Talpiot had been written by Chaim Heller, and the very last edition of Talpiot was a memorial volume for Chaim Heller, which our father saw through to completion. Speaking of our father. Yeah. Right. So, David Mirsky, MTA, class of 1938. There he is. See, this is still there. Right? His lifelong friend Morris Epstein, who we'll be talking about. He enters YU in 1934. Aside from a couple of years downtown, about which we'll hear about, he's at YU in one fashion or other continuously from entering in 1934 till the day of his funeral in 1982. So this is, in many ways, especially this part of the talk, is a love story about YU in a lot of respects. He graduates, you're the Masmid of the class of 1942 of Yeshiva College, right? In Yeshiva College, he was one of the founders of the Yeshiva College Dramatic Society. And here, the Yeshiva College Dramatic Societies, their production of what I think Wings Over Europe, being reviewed in the New York Daily Mirror, which was one of the Hearst newspapers of the time. It gets a very nice and appreciative review. Now, the editor of his yearbook, that year, the Masmid class of 1942, is Joseph Sokolow, who, our uncle, right, and father of our own rabbi professor, Moshe Sokolow of Colchester, Connecticut, and indeed Professor Yehudah Mirsky, his family, his father and grandfather are from Colchester, Connecticut. So this becomes a very family affair. With time, he picks up another brother-in-law in the YU orbit, Rabbi Dr. Gershon Appel, who's our mother's older brother. So, like as I said, Joseph Sokolow, back to that in a second. Joseph Sokolow marries our mother's Hannah, our mother's sister Hannah, and Uncle Gershon marries Miriam Cohen, who becomes our Aunt Miriam through him, of course. Now, so he was as a graduate of Yeshiva, I think class of 1940, and had an exemplary career at first as a rabbi and did his PhD. What? 1938? Okay. So that's why I said I was going to get corrected. It was very close to Dr. Revel, and was president of Yeshiva College Student Council, if I recall correctly. Did his PhD with Harry Wolfson, and which eventually resulted in this volume, which has recently been reprinted, as well as after a very distinguished career in the rabbinate, became the chairman of the philosophy department at Stern College, and also the author of these two volumes of the Concise Code of Jewish Law, which also have recently been republished. Joseph Sokolow was also extremely active, him and Hannah were extremely active in the world of the Mizrahi, and also lived in Borough Park, and so we're in very close touch with my grandfather Shmuel Kalman and Shmuel Amid over the years. Now, after getting smicha at YU, so our father goes to work at Hapoel Mizrahi, and he edits its journal, The Jewish Horizon. Right? So again, interestingly, Hapoel Mizrahi was a real thing in America. It was a very active movement in America. It's kind of gone out of business in part because it's one of the only Zionist movements in America, most of whose leaders eventually went on Aliyah. Right? He also, in addition to editing the magazine, he was also the educational director for Hapoel Mizrahi, and I have all sorts of curricula that he wrote. And eventually he starts teaching at YU. He does his graduate work at NYU at Columbia and comes to YU and teaches English literature. He had all kinds of stories. It was not an easy thing to be an Orthodox Jewish student in Columbia in the late 1940s, especially if you're entering the sanctum sanctorum of English literature. Right? These were the years when Columbia was going crazy because Lionel Trilling had gotten a job teaching English literature, and he had all kinds of stories. So he teaches English and Hebrew literature here at YU and becomes the dean of admissions. Hence this item from inside YU from the early 1960s. And he starts to get involved in the world of higher education. And this is going to be something we're going to be talking about in this talk. So, for instance, around this time, he secures approval from the college entry examination board that you can use Hebrew as a language to qualify on your college boards, right? He's one of the people who arranges for SATs to be given on Sundays, because they were given on Saturdays. He starts getting involved in the Middle States Association. for accreditation of colleges and universities. Very much under the influence of Dr. Samuel Belkin. So Dr. Belkin is a major figure in all of this. I love this picture of Belkin because it's also him with then Senator John Kennedy, 1953. And Dr. Belkin is a figure who is intellectually about fostering, first here, Dr. Belkin is building this institution and also building it as an American institution, and this is crucial. Sort of the context here is the vast expansion in American higher education after World War II. Right? After World War II, the government is pouring a lot of money into higher education, and universities are expanding in all kinds of ways, and Yeshiva is very much a part of that. And there's the sense that Yeshiva is also supposed to be engaged with the society at large. Right? So it builds a school of social work, school of psychology and education. Right? Dr. Belkin, a number of his essays are actually very interesting for his idea of what it means to, sort of this vision of what he calls a successful transplantation of Judaism into the American landscape that actually achieves, right, a kind of, to use a term that becomes very popular later on, synthesis. Dr. Belkin's book, in his image, is where he lays out this very humanistically minded reading of rabbinic texts. In some respects, it also would be a good thing for someone, and our father was very involved. There were two people who were very involved in helping him with this. Our father and Sidney Honig were his two assistants on writing this. And this also, what's very interesting, it's also of a piece with the way human rights was talked about early on in the 1940s and 50s, was very much in terms of the human person and ideas of, and religiously oriented ideas of the human person. And this is the vision that's part of the vision that's very much guiding Dr. Belkin in his creation and the growth and development of Yeshiva. Now, this is a photo I love. So, our father with Morris Epstein, who we last saw, right, in MTA, then again did his doctorate. He wrote this book, Mishlei Sendebar, sort of these medieval Hebrew travel tales, and eventually becomes the chair of the English department at Stern College. And can anyone guess? My sister Tzipora figured it out. Who's sitting there with them? Can anyone old YU people remember? Joe Ellenberg. Remember? Right, Joe Ellenberg, who for years was the director of the budget here at YU. And so what I love about this picture is, first of all, you see they're just loving being with one another. And so you see these three young men who, from what we know of their lives, they're devoting their lives to these shared ideals.
Where was this?
I think it was at Farm Foods. Doesn't that look like Farm Foods? But I can't remember what street it was on.
49th?
What?
49th?
Something like that.
48, 49.
48, 49, like 6th and 7th, Mashu Kazet. Right, that's what I'm thinking. With an inscription from Morris Epstein from Shakespeare. So what I love about this picture, in addition to the period and all, is these three young men who, from what we know, are in the early stages of devoting their lives to this ideal of creating a yeshiva university. Right? And one that's going to be engaged with the wider culture. Indeed, now another thing that Morris Epstein does, in addition to being the chairman of the English department at Stern College, is he's the editor of a children's magazine called World Over. Some of us grew up on World Over, right? He, and what was his name? Yechezkel Schloss, I think, was the fellow who did the artwork for it. And it came out for years, this wonderful magazine of Jewish culture and history and this and that. And his friend Dave had a regular section there called Now You Know, which was fun tidbits about Jewish history. And sort of done up, our father did not do the artwork here, someone else did that, but these fun little tidbits about Jewish news and Jewish history. And so the point here, what's so striking about this, is that for Morris Epstein, for our father, There's no contradiction between being a hoity-toity professor, university administrator, and writing a children's magazine. It's part of the same enterprise, and it's all part of the same labor of love, right? So YU is coming into its own. This is our mother, okay, Sarah Mirsky, also known as Sudi Mirsky. So I'm suspecting was this like a groundbreaking for the morgue, maybe? Yeah. What? I don't know what this, I haven't been able to figure out what event this was, but part of why I love this photo is, you look at this, and this is like, to me, this is like, so much of this photo is Yeshiva coming of age in like the late 50s. What? Abby Belkin? Okay, that's Abby Belkin, right. Yeshiva coming of age in the late 50s, the early 1960s, part of this exuberant American optimism, part of it like taking its place in this new kind of American society, and in this outward-looking, right? If you look at, the diversity of the participants here in this outward-looking way, I can't help but note that Blue Greenberg has told me that for her and her friends growing up, our mother was something of a role model, that you could be an Orthodox woman who was also very well-spoken, dressed, very elegantly, and all of that. So this is looking to me like early 1960s, right? I don't have the dates on this, but this is what, that's that sort of thing, the Jackie. Okay. Now, so one of the things that our father does, and again, this is part of, the context of YU is part of the expansion of American higher education in the post-war years. The National Defense Language Institute conducted at Yeshiva University, right? As part of, sort of like, back in those years, the word defense was slapped onto all sorts of appropriations. But the idea is here, America's a global power and we have to be studying languages, and YU had the wit to understand that Hebrew should be one of them. And so YU ran these programs with which were then these brand new technologies of language labs, and these photos of our father showing people how to use the headphones and with the tapes and all this and all this kind of thing. And here he is, and this part of it was conducted in Israel here at the Givat Ram campus of Hebrew. And educational television in the early 1960s. So take a look here. His contract with WABC TV, right, the local ABC affiliate, to do a series America Through 13 Pairs of Eyes. So it was different perspectives on American literature. Here you see he's talking about Nathaniel Hawthorne. But also what was very interesting was that he was also lecturing the number of these episodes were about minorities in American literature, hence the reference to James Baldwin in the title, right? James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, Pietro Di Donato, who was the African-American, the big important Italian-American writer of the time. Indeed, he was one of the, I don't think he was the, okay, it's like this. Who here knows the story of when Philip Roth came to YU? Right? Philip Roth famously came to YU and all broke loose. Right. I think it was David Fleischer who initiated the invitation. I don't know, but our father was involved in it. And Roth, there was this famously violent confrontation. I think it was in this building between Philip Roth and enraged students of Yeshiva College. Roth didn't talk about it for years. He used to threaten to sue anybody who did talk about it. And then decades later, I have to say, our mother is walking along Columbus Avenue and Philip Roth walks by and says, "Hey, I know you. Where do I know you from?" And she says, "Oh, well, that night, at YU." And he said, "Oh, yes, and right, and your husband was this rabbi professor who tried to be nice to me," or something like that. Okay. So, in a way, remember he was one of the founders of the Yeshiva College Dramatic Society, right? He used to do his own makeup when he did these things. And so there are certain respects in that, our father, there were aspects of the theater that never left him, in a sense. He was a very humble man. And he wasn't a theatrical person, as our brother Moshe Tzvi likes to, he said at his funeral, he was, the gentlest man we knew. But he knew how to take from the theater, sort of like, the pregnant hush, the truth of the soliloquy, the grace of the spoken word, and use it very gently but very powerfully. And here, engaging some serious issues in this is taking place in the early 1960s, 1964, 1965, when these issues of the representation of minorities are actually starting to boil over in American culture, and the rabbi from Yeshiva is the guy standing here talking about it. Right, so that's the contract over. See it there, yeah, television. It's just one photo of Shai Agnon with her grandfather and father, though I suspect this photo was taken in Israel, because that's our Uncle Chaim Malumad, right? Yeah. So I don't know exactly what the occasion was, but they're all in conversation. He also had a radio show on WHN, and was very much discussing issues of higher education. It was called College Clinic, and here he has all kinds of, right? This is, again, the era of Vatican II, right? Sort of like, insert your joke about the rabbi and the priest walking into a recording studio. But again, there's this very ecumenical spirit of the time. I don't know which cleric that is. And he was, but he had this radio. And again, the radio show was not just dealing with Jewish affairs. It was a radio show about issues in higher education. And then, in 1969, he's appointed Dean of Stern College. Okay? He's appointed Dean of Stern College, and in his years at Stern College is when, as Rabbi Berman acknowledged noted in a recent article in Lair House, the first steps towards eventually creating the Beit Midrash for women take place under his tenure at Dean. He also creates the program with Stern College and FIT. And just generally the years at Stern College and he's also involved in building what was then the new building of Stern College, and these are very rewarding years. With the passing of he also becomes involved in something called American Professors for Peace in the Middle East. He's one of the founders of. Shortly after 1967, a group of largely American Jewish, not all Jewish though, professors of different, very much of political science and history and government, but not only, decide that they need to start organizing in order to foster constructive, intelligent discussions of Middle East policy and so on. And he's one of the founders, eventually becomes the chairman, and this is their journal, Middle East Review. Again, for people looking for, students looking for projects, like a history of what was called APME, American Professors of Peace in the Middle East, would be, just a really nice project. He also, like his father, Shmuel Kalman, became the president of Histadrut Ivrit B'Amerika, became the president of the official Hebrew Institute of Hebrew Federation of America. I remember when we, the American Hebrew poet Gabriel Prial had visited our grandparents in Borough Park, and our father was a little boy, and he said, when he found out that Gabriel Prial was a poet, he said, "Atam shorer harishon sheli." So many years later, decades later, my father's the president of Histadrut Ivrit, and we're walking along Riverside Drive, and there's Gabriel Prial. And we talk, and he says to my father, "Al tishkach, ani am shorer." Because the Hebrew movement in America doesn't work. In the end, right? It doesn't quite work. I mean, and there's something very sad about it. Where the joke in the family used to be that when he would go to these meetings of Histadrut Ivrit, we would call them the boys, right? I mean, because he was always the youngest person in the room, and he was well into his 50s. It didn't work for a number of reasons, and again, it didn't work. Americans don't learn languages. A lot of the people who believed in it went on Aliyah. Even the cultural, Professor Schneider presumably has a thing or two to say about this as well, but also notice I put Bialik in the title of this lecture. They went on worshiping Bialik. This was the point that Michael Weingrad made in this wonderful book a few years ago. They were all, for entirely legitimate reasons, worshiping Bialik decades after Hebrew literature in Israel had gone elsewhere. Right? So they weren't quite able to maintain that kind of connection with things that were going on. And also perhaps, sustaining it. Once religious people began to lose interest in Hebrew, as they did here at YU, it was even harder to sustain. But this was another facet of his work. Eventually he becomes acting vice president for academic affairs here at YU. He's engaged in a number of projects. One of them is YU becomes one of the very first places to do Holocaust studies in America, right? And sort of the book that in many respects put Holocaust issues on the map in American culture is Lucy Davidowitz's War Against the Jews. And if you take a look at Lucy Davidowitz's War Against the Jews, the first acknowledgement is, I'd like to thank Dean David Mirsky, who convinced me to come teach a course on this at Stern College. Right? But he also writes early on about what he called about the uses and abuses of the Holocaust in American literature. He's also involved in early iterations of what eventually becomes the Bar-Ilan CD, the Bar-Ilan database. I remember he comes home and we're sitting at the Shabbos table and he's telling us about these things with computers that they're starting to talk about putting Shilas and Shuvas on computers and so on. Eventually, he after, he was like, as those of you spend time around academia know, being a gifted administrator is a gift and it's also a curse. So he finally was able, after a number of years, was able to return to the classroom still sometime, after the passing of Dr. Belkin and the shape of his administrative responsibilities shifted, returns to the classroom and returns to the work of writing and teaching. So this is some of his scholarship. Also, I put it up on my page at academia.edu. You can find it there. And this is a volume, his scholarly work that was published posthumously. Ephraim Luzzatto, right? The name Luzzatto is familiar to us all because of the Ramchal. Ephraim Luzzatto was, so to speak, the ne'er-do-well cousin of the Ramchal, lived for many years in London, where he was associating with actors and other similarly questionable characters. And in 1766 or 1768, depending on how it goes, published a book called Eila B'nei HaNeurim, which is maybe the founding work of modern Hebrew lyric poetry. And so this is a study that our father did that was published posthumously, and thanks to my sister's poet, came out in Hebrew translation a few years thereafter. This is just a photo that I love. So, if I were to sum up, our father passes away in 1982. I love this picture because also the sheer openness of it, and that's, I think, when I reflect, and for purposes of this lecture, and which I thank Professor Berger and Dr. Horowitz once again for initiating. Well, first off, just a word about ecumenicism, right? Both Shmuel Kalman Mirsky and David Mirsky were figures who were able to reach, to speak to, and across what, especially from our perspective today, is a remarkably diverse range of people and individuals. As mentioned, I published a book about Rav Kook a couple of years ago. I got an email from a longtime member, a longtime librarian at Hebrew Union College, right, flagship movement, institution of the Reform movement downtown. And he said, I don't have a whole lot to tell you about Rabbi Kook, but I can tell you about what happened at HUC the day your father died. And it was this extraordinary depiction of, like, a circular had gone out saying, we're sorry to report the death of our colleague at Yeshiva University, David Mirsky. And so it was all rather sudden and tragic. And like we say in Hebrew, Ashkara. So, like, Gene Borowitz he just found him leaning against the wall, clutching this circular, unable to move. And he poked his head into Harry Orlinsky's office, and Harry Orlinsky was just weeping at his desk. And said, I just can't talk, go away. And he said it was one thing like that after another. So here was a man who devoted his entire life to Yeshiva University. And the Reform movement is weeping at his passing. He told me once he was in the library at JTS, and Seymour Siegel, my dear friend David Pollack was very close with Seymour Siegel. Seymour Siegel, who passed away some years ago. What year did he pass away, David? Do you remember? 82, right? The same year. But was a leading thinker of the conservative movement, And so my father in the JTS library and said to him, Reb David, Malakoin beves hakvaros. And our father said to him, no, you should quote me the pasuk, Mali yedidi bevesi. So that was the spirit. And there was a great generosity. There's a story I love to tell. Bernie Lander left YU, started creating Torah College. Abba knew a lot about how you build institutions. He was very good at it. So Bernie started calling him, David, how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I get accreditation? How do I make a program? How do I do this? How do I do that? What do you do? So he went to Dr. Belkin and said, Bernie's calling me. What am I supposed to do? And Dr. Belkin said, David, give him all the help he needs. And he said, he's trying to compete with us, right? And Dr. Belkin said to him, David, there's no such thing as too much Jewish education. The world needs Jewish schools. Help him. Give him all the help you can. And so, night after night, the phone would ring like at around 9. And there's Bernie Lander, and can I talk to your father? And he just stood there and gave him this advice for which he never took a penny. So, I mean, just in reflect, and for purposes of this evening, and again, thank you all very, very much for coming. When I think about our father, our grandfather, they weren't afraid. I mean, there were things they were scared of in life, like every human being. But in a deep sense, their fundamental stances weren't fearful. They had a very deep and humane kind of faith. Perhaps it was related to their Zionism in some ways. That a very grounded sense of their own peoplehood and their own identity, and the sense that engaging with modernity, they're part of a national revival, and they have a profound base in Eretz Yisrael. Something about their having come from Eretz Yisrael gave them a kind of cultural self-confidence, but also this great belief in people and not being scared of engaging with people who were very different from them. And coupled with like a profound belief in Torah and a profound belief in human dignity. Shortly before he died, the commentator at the time I remember soliciting like credo statements from people. And they solicited one from our father. And he said, like, a Jew who really believes isn't scared of history and isn't scared of like encountering their historical moment, their time, their place. If you believe in Torah, then you believe that Torah can actually deal with it and enrich the human condition whenever and wherever it is found. So in some ways it's a very Zionist story, in some ways it's a very American story, and I'll just close with one last story. When I was in high school here in MTA, and my classmate Larry Rabinovich is here, for a good few years there I was, pretty yeshivish and very unbearable. And that's the man who's been on an even keel for as long as I've known. And but one time we were walking to shul, where we lived on the west side of Manhattan, and I asked, what's the difference between you and the really frum people? Also back then I think we called them chnyaks. Charedim hadn't been invented yet. And he said, well, there's some people for whom Torah and halacha is a fence. They see it fundamentally as a fence. So if you're in the fence business, then by definition, the fence can never be tall enough. The moat can never be deep enough. You can never have too much jagged glass on top of it. The barbed wire can't be sharp enough, right? So I said, okay, but then, so if it's not a fence, then what is it to you? He said, it's a way of life. It's a way of moving. A Torah v'mitzvah is a way of moving through time, through space, engaging with other people. And he said it's a different angle of vision. But once you adopt that angle of vision, just everything starts to look different. And that's something I've tried to take with me. And thank you all for letting me share a little bit of it with you tonight.
Thank you. So, thank you very much. We'll take 10 minutes for questions, but first I have a Yetzer to tell you two little stories that were suggested by this talk. One has to do with the worship of Bialik, which is well deserved. I totally agree that it's well deserved. But I think you know this story. I was once speaking when I think I may have still been in Flatbush High School when this happened. I'm not sure. I was speaking to Mr. Braverman, the founder of Flatbush, the legendary founder of Flatbush, and he told me in his old age he became somewhat more frum, and he initiated a second hour of Gemara each day, at least in the A class of the high school. But the Board of Education resisted. So he had to persuade them. And to this day, I don't know whether he was saying this as an expression of his own view or as a means of persuading them. I really don't know for sure. But he said, he told them, and this worked, that they need to understand the importance of Talmud. He said, Hisparti lahem et chashivut ha-Talmud, she'arei b'li Talmud אי אפשר להבין את ביאליק. So that illustrates the point, I think, reasonably well. And the other thing that is just a real Yetzer Hara. We spoke about the ecumenical aspects. We saw David Mirsky interviewing a priest, and we saw Dr. Belkin with John Kennedy. The following, so it's probably a true story, is that when there's a Kennedy entity as part of Einstein.
For mental health.
Yeah, and when it was dedicated, the Kennedy family, of course, was there, and so was Cardinal Spellman, who was also mentioned in this presentation. He was there because of the Kennedys, and he was sitting next to Dr. Belkin, and he said to Dr. Belkin, we have something in common, we both wear skull caps. And Dr. Belkin responded, and there remains validity in this response. He said, that's true, but the difference is that your skull cap is red and your organization is in the black. My skull cap is black, and you can finish this.
So, by the way, I just have to add, there was a great, at times, my father had the story that he would accompany Dr. Belkin to these ecumenical gatherings in the 60s, and you may have noticed, there's a yarmulke that he always wore, this black satin yarmulke that had like a kind of gold trim around it. And he noticed that at different these gatherings, the clergy, the Catholic clergy, would be following him around and hanging on his every word and paying very little attention to Dr. Belkin, which didn't really. So he asked them once, what is it? They said, well, obviously you outrank him. Because his skull cap is just this little black thing, and you have the one with the gold embroidery.
So let's take some questions.
Yes, please. Any?
Yes.
Short question.
Yes.
Loud, please.
Two short questions. The first one is you're trying to attribute an openness to these figures. One thing that I took away from this
Sure.
is that the Jewish world, don't forget, seems to have been much smaller, or the Orthodox world was much smaller at the time. Or not even Orthodox, but conservative, reform. It's the same players, only taking on different roles, perhaps, educated in the same background. Perhaps Israel didn't have that much to do with it, but rather their familial connection, their teachers, their academic affiliation, their yeshiva affiliation, regardless of whether they were Orthodox or conservative or what have you. So that's number one. The second thing I just wanted to point out that, there were Haredim at that time also, or people
Yes.
who did affiliate who were not that monolithic. You had Shlomo Yosef Zevin, you had others. Perhaps they didn't have the academic training, so they're not out in the world as much. But to paint them as sort of like, well, there's you, and then there's the benighted Haredi, I think that's a little unfair.
I was actually not trying to paint a picture. I was just sort of trying to describe the lives of these individuals and was not trying to illustrate benighted Haredim. I will tell a story that my father told me once, that one of the heads of Agudas Yisrael, Imkvar, YU gave a lot of help to different Haredi figures when they came to America, which they never acknowledged. And my father, I don't want to say the name, but my father asked a leading figure in Agudas Yisrael once, you remember all the things we did for you in the 40s and the 50s and opening doors and arranging this and that? He said, of course I do. And he said, will you ever acknowledge it in public? He said, of course not. Okay. But that's just a story that one has to tell. But yes, obviously that. And also, yes, there's something here about a greater, what do you call, like, ethno-cultural homogeneity of American Jewry in those years that plays some role here. But still, I think there's something very principled about it as well. The ethno-cultural homogeneity doesn't necessarily lend itself to the kinds of principled big tentness, for lack of, and again, also they're both, certainly in the case of her grandfather, he's deeply influenced by Rav Kook, for whom in a deep sense, the river of truth is one in many ways. So, by the way, I would just like to acknowledge that Dr. Horvitz was a great help and assistance to our grandfather in his work over many years, and it's just an honor to have you here. My brother-in-law Micha gets pride of. I take the chair's prerogative. Well, I'm taking the chair's prerogative of view from you.
You described a duality, as you say,
Yes.
between your father and your grandfather in terms of their life and their world. Could you sort of divide that duality? How much was sort of in the worldly sense versus how much was influenced by the Jewish sense? Was it half and half? Was it 60-40? Was it 70-30?
I did
In that wall that your father described,
Right.
It was already world, it was like trying not to create the duality at all. How was that mesh?
I don't know. I mean, part of it is obviously, being in America and being still like a minority culture in America. But part of it is also like a choice of which elements of Jewish culture and tradition you want to foreground, right? While you're working this out. And again, part of it is, I think there's also a cultural self-confidence that comes from being rooted, not just in America, but also being rooted in kind of Zionism.
No, they could
as
have done
well.
it if they were conservative leadership or
You mean the conservative capital C?
Yes.
Basically, I'm not going to, but they're clearly not operating within the framework of conservative Judaism.
As Orthodox Jews.
As very much as Orthodox Jews.
Okay, so there are 3 hands up, and there will be 3 questions. One, two, three.
Please.
I was wondering, the ecumenicism of
All of that.
Your father, grandfather, Shadal keeps on
Right.
coming to my mind. Did your
He did.
grandfather,
I think he
father-
did. I think my grandfather did write a bit about Shadal, and I think, and I think he wrote some on Shadal. I think there were also some works of Shadal that he had published. Yeah,
That's- okay.
yeah. He says good. Yeah.
Can you tell us something about the interactions of that
Right.
Rabbi Dr. Mirsky had with the other great Rabbanu of Bar Park, like
Joel Shmuel.
Greenberg's father, Rabbi Dr. Shore, who was the rabbi.
Perhaps Aaron Bell has what to say about that. I mean, my understanding is that it was like all very respectful. I think there were some resentments as well. Every now and then, this Zionische guy sort of somehow is occupying this kind of place here, but not from really important rabbanim. I mean, occasionally Shemati Harikot, but my sense is that it was all. Ein ma lasod, he was a big Talmud Chacham. And that.
Zionist rabbis.
Yeah, no, but also, I mean, even I once saw, and it was a circulating memoir, I think, of Rav Paleov, where he said he's talking about. I think the family didn't publish, but he's talking about different figures of YU, and he said, Mirsky was also one of these Chachmas Yisrael people, but at least he was a Talmud Chacham and you could talk to him. So I think he in those respects, he was a recognizable figure, and sat on Batei Din, and there's Rev Eliezer Silver used to call him a lot and consult with him on questions. He had. I mean, that was the basic the spine of it. So you had a question?
Last question.
Sorry, it's about a side point, but what happened when Philip Roth came to IM?
Well, are you familiar with the early writings of Philip Roth?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
He spoke about
By the way, I mean, I have to say, I revere the memory of Rabbi Emanuel Rackman, but I think there's a letter that appears in one of the Zuckerman books that, an irate rabbi writes about Zuckerman, and I think it's based on a letter. If I'm wrong, unless I'm wrong,
you're right.
I think it was based on a letter that Rabbi Rackman wrote about what kind of. I mean, Rabbi Rackman is a whole story, and sort of his involvements and ecumenical and political involvements in the 40s, 50s, 60s is a tale unto itself. Philip Roth, Jews are striving to be accepted in America, and Philip Roth is right. I mean, again, you've read Portnoy's Complaint? Okay, right. So having read it, I have to say, so now we may perhaps to begin, right? I mean, what's interesting, maybe one of the interesting things about Philip Roth, it's not just, especially early Philip Roth, but Philip Roth in general, it's not just that he's like a very skillful writer and was something of a sensationalist. He also takes Judaism very seriously. So like Goodbye Columbus, right, also has that story, Eli the Fanatic, where like a traditional Orthodox Jew from Eastern Europe shows up and everybody around him starts collapsing of their own contradictions, right? So Roth like brilliantly was touching nerves. At the same time, he was being far more extroverted or exhibitionist about eroticism and sexual fantasies and so on, in a way that we sort of take as like mabekach nowadays, but at the time, very wasn't. So there's a sense that like, you know, and also because I mean, okay, this is, as in his scholarly work, okay, so my father's scholarly work was on English literature. He wrote early works on Milton and rabbinic literature, and his big dream was to write something, a comparative study of Irish literature and modern Hebrew literature. But in his work on American literature in the novel, he wrote about what these American Jewish writers did in the post-war world. And a lot of it he described as breaking the grip of Ernest Hemingway, right? They're reintroducing language, and they're reintroducing moralism, and everything that in Hemingway's world makes Jews despicable, right? Sort of the moralism, the seemingly neurotic behavior, this and that. They're kind of sort of they're putting forward as the more honest way of approaching the human condition. I mean, so there's a larger cultural drama here of Jews staking out their place in the American literary landscape, and who's doing it for them, right? It's and because he's also like, my sense is like positioning himself as the new American Jewish writer, and this is what he's presenting. Now, the people who are I wasn't here at the time. The people who are furious about Philip Roth, I don't exactly know what they were expecting him to write. Maybe if he would have written the other Roth, Henry Roth, Call It Sleep, with this remarkably lyrical vision, stream of consciousness, vision of what it is to be an immigrant child on the Lower East Side, that might have resonated a little better. Also because you can't, like Roth, like he wasn't like, in terms of like other acceptable Jewish heresies, it's like he wasn't obviously socialist, and he wasn't obviously involved with labor or social justice or anything like that. Rabbi Carmi, please.
I don't want to diverge from the subject
But please.
of Roth, but just comments. My sense is that
Sure.
what people were angry about in Yeshiva, and I wasn't around at the time, was not the eroticism, but particular characters.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, a story about a Jewish soldier who tries to use his religion to avoid
Okay.
his
Mm-hmm.
duties.
Mm-hmm. So that-
particularly lit views.
Mm-hmm.
Many years later, Maurice Wargler
Mm-hmm.
interviewed Roth, and that
Incident.
episode did come up in the
Mm-hmm.
interview. Not really open, not with all the naked details, but he was willing to talk about it there. I think it was in Modern Judaism.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you.
1999.
Oh, thank you. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.